Birds of a Feather by Whitney Angel. Summary. Tim got used to it, the organized chaos, the chirping and cooing, and the occasional feathers in his coffee, the flock of doves following him around and nesting in his drawers, the murder of crows bringing him shiny trinkets and stealing his pens. It became his normal. For over a year, and some change, the nest felt full, lively, predictable even. Until the day he came home from patrol, coffee in one hand, data chip in the other, and found a raven sitting on his desk. Just there, like he owned the place, staring, silent, still, like a ghost. And Tim just blinked and said, "Okay, that's new." Chapter 1. A Nest of Birds. Summary. Where Tim gets adopted by a lament of doves and a murder of crows. There's an old Aesop fable, one of those quaint little moral stories people love to misinterpret on social media, about a cat who fell so deeply in love with a man that she begged Aphrodite to turn her human, and because Aphrodite is nothing if not dramatic, she agreed. The cat was transformed, a full human woman, lovely, elegant, and for a time she lived in perfect bliss beside her beloved, married, nestled in silk sheets, sipping wine instead of licking puddles. It was everything she dreamed of until a mouse ran across the room. She leaped from the bed like a rocket, hunting the mouse with every ounce of feline glee still lingering in her bones, and her husband recoiled in horror, realizing that no matter how beautiful her exterior, the instincts remained. The moral supposedly is that no matter how much someone change on the outside, if they don't do the inner work, they will always chase the mouse. Tim Drake had heard that story once, or maybe read it on a random scroll of old Gotham Library archives while avoiding sleep. Either way, he wasn't thinking about ancient feline metaphors the night he found his first bird. It hadn't been long since he'd taken on the mantle of Red Robin, long enough to know how the mask felt, but not long enough to stop checking the mirror to see if he still recognized himself under it. He was nearly settled into the nest, his personal penthouse turned base of operations, a place he once shared with Cass for a while before she'd taken off again. Now it echoed with the kind of silence only Gotham would twist into loneliness. That night on patrol he wasn't looking for companionship. He was looking for a gang activity, or a distraction, or a way to justify being out at 3:14 a.m. instead of trying to sleep like a normal person. Instead, he found a dove. She was huddled in the corner of a fire escape, her left wing at a wrong angle and her feathers ruffled from either the rooftop scuffle or Gotham's signature blend of atmospheric spite. Red Roman didn't even think about it. He crouched, coaxed her into his hands with a quiet voice and a protein bar wrapper, and took her home. He figured she'd be gone once healed, like most things in his life, but she stayed. He named her Lady, mostly because she was oddly refined for a bird native to Gotham. She didn't peck at wires, didn't scream at 5 a.m., and bless her, she never pooped on their computer. As her wing healed, Lady began to linger. First, it was just visits. Then it was full-on occupancy. She had a spot near the comms desk, a perch on the back of the couch. She cooed when Tim was distressed, and flapped disappointedly when he skipped meals. The nest didn't feel so empty anymore. Maybe it was silly, maybe it was sad, but for the first time in weeks, Tim felt like someone was happy he came home. It started with Lady, but she didn't come alone for long. Soon she began arriving with company. At first, Tim assumed the extra visitors were temporary, birds being birds. Friends dropping in for free seats and a heated perch. Nothing serious, until 2 doves started showing up, so regularly. Tim had started naming their food bowls. Cece and Didi arrived together, although, if pressed, Tim would swear Cece flew in first. She always did things first. First to enter, first to land, first to casually perch near a drug deal like it was just another Tuesday. Cece had this unnerving habit of standing completely still. in the shadiest parts of town, perfectly positioned near gang spots and arms deals. She wasn't subtle, just overlooked. The kind of bird no one questioned. Tim admired her tactical instincts. She was, however, absolutely useless if Dee Dee was with her. Their mission performance dropped by 87% the moment they shared a rooftop. Cece had this absent-minded float to her attention span, like a golf ballerina lost in thought. Pair that with Dee Dee, soft, puffy, and flustered by her own shadow, and you had the world's cutest surveillance liability. They sit next to each other on a windsill, blinking slowly while crime happened 6 feet away. Still, Cece was reliable on her own. She preferred quiet when at the nest. Had an unfortunate fondness for the most expensive bird seed Tim could find, and could give the bad computer a run for its money when it came to identifying gang symbols from above. She was precision rubbed in feathers. Meanwhile, Dee Dee was the first of the new recruits to fully move in. She claimed a drawer in the nest before Tim realized those could even open drawers. She was soft and sweet and perpetually overwhelmed by existence. Every time Tim got too close, she'd coo anxiously, cover her face with one wing, and pretend to be grooming like it was all very casual and not at all because she was experiencing emotional combustion. Tim, having more than enough experience, pretending to be fine in close proximity to people he liked, recognized the signs immediately. He adjusted. He stopped looking directly at her, but made sure to speak to her with a very particular tone, gentle, distinct, unmistakably meant just for her. "Good work, Dee Dee," he'd say, without turning his head. "Perfect placement today." She'd puff up twice her size and squeak behind her wings. And flustered as she was, she had an incredible eye for detail. Where Cece could infiltrate, Dee Dee could place. She found the best microphone spots, the blind angles in alley cameras, the places even criminals forgot to watch. When she wasn't overwhelmed by direct attention, she was Gotham's most adorable, efficient little raccoon bird. She was also terrible anxious if left alone. Tim learned it the hard way after one incident involving a locked window, a mirror, a minor thunderstorm, and a nearly escaped panic dove. Since then, Cece had her own anxiety nest, made of soft clothes, backup treats, and a white noise machine. Gotham may be cold, but Tim Drake wasn't cruel. Besides, she was a real cutie when she got treats. Tilted head, wings twitching, eyes bright like she'd never expected kindness. Tim pretended to not be emotionally affected. He failed miserably. The last of the does to claim the nest as her own was Madam. Older, wiser, and absolute not here for anyone's nonsense. Madonna had the no-nonsense grace of a bird who'd seen things. She didn't flutter or fluster. She stumbled. The younger doves deferred to her instinctively, and Tim quickly learned to do the same, unless he wanted a beak in the ear. She was the best collector of them all. While Cece specialized in perching over danger zones, and Dee Dee had a sixth sense for surveillance blind spots. Madonna could walk into a crime scene, figuratively speaking, and pull out 3 pieces of intel no one else would have noticed. A drop burner phone, the way one man's shoes didn't match the gang's collar, the receipt stuck at the bottom of a boot. If she could talk, Tim suspected she'd had a side career as a detective and another as a no-sense school principal. Unlike the others, Madonna didn't treat Tim like a human. She treated him like a particular dumb baby bird who refused to stay in the nest. Every time he came home injured, and it was Gotham, so it happened often, she would flip aggressively, peck at his cheek or ear, and particularly hurt him to the first aid kit, with a pointed coo that translated to something like, "Sit down, you absolute disaster of a man-child." And heaven help him if he tried to pretend the wound wasn't that bad. Madonna didn't do denial, or excuses, or untreated injuries. She was also Tim's personal alarm clock, even better than Tim's own meticulously set system of phone alarms, digital reminders, and backup caffeine pills. If he was late waking up for patrol, for a board meeting, or, for the love of God, a shower, Madonna would yank the sheets off, landed on his chest, and started honking in his face like a judgmental mother goose. He wasn't proud of how many times that had worked. Still, for all the unique traits and combustions, Tim had a soft spot for Lady. She'd found him first, back when he still flinched at the creak of his own penthouse walls. When the nest was just a series of empty rooms, filled with broken tech, unopened boxes, and memories he wasn't sure he wanted to unpack, Lady had been a flutter of white in the grey, a presence that didn't ask questions or expect answers. She simply was, loyal, quiet, patient. The flock followed her. She was the matriarch, the commander, the emotional support dove, and somehow the only creature in the known universe who could find Tim anywhere. It didn't matter if he was undercover as Red Robin in the Narrows or given a press interview on the 72nd floor of Wayne Enterprises. Lady could find him, and she would. There were at least a dozen photos floating around the tabloids of Gotham's youngest tech CEO leaving work in a sleek three-piece suit, only to be promptly dive-bombed by a snow-white dove and covered in coos and wing flaps before he'd even reached the sidewalk. The newspapers had a field day. Gotham's Disney princess, CEO's real bird of prey, Tim Drake Wayne, technist genius, bird whisperer, closet enchanter, businessman, or secret forest steward, the feathered truth. Tim had a folder dedicated to the headlines. He pretended it was for legal documentation, but even he couldn't lie to himself that well. Still, Lady was why he started using the birds as recon in the first place. She was the one who proved it could work, who showed him that perception wasn't always about the gadgets. It could be instinct, connection, trust. He didn't need $1 million drone when he had a flock of semi-domestic winged weirdos with loyal issues and surprising levels of intelligence. The nest wasn't just a base anymore. It was a home filled with white feathers. And despite the fact that Tim had a lament following him around, he had never felt the furthest away from sorrowful. But sooner than later, his llama turned into murder. Tim's first crow arrived the day he turned 18. It had been a particularly Gotham sort of day. Gray skies, ankle-deep puddles, and a special kind of drizzle that made you feel like a half-drowned sewer rat before you even got out the door. Tim had been dreading patrol, sitting slumped at his desk, giving himself a pep talk that was 90% caffeine and 10% passive-aggressive glaring at the rain. He was mid-sulk when something crash-landed through the drove's private window like a flying bowling ball in a leather jacket. Black feathers everywhere, a very indignant squawk, a flurry of coos from the flock. The doves weirdly did not react with alarm. If anything, they looked pleased. Timo had installed the window with the sole purpose of giving his doves safe, secret access to the nest. Stared in stunned betrayal as a soaked, ragged-looking crow casually took over his desk chair like he paid rent. The crow didn't say anything, obviously, but Tim could feel the attitude. After watching his girls treat the crow like a mild annoyance but tolerated cousin, Tim begrudgingly offered it some of the high-quality seed mix he usually reserved for Madonna's Don't Die Tim negations. The crow ate like it hadn't seen food since birth and promptly fell asleep on top of Tim's calm table. Thus began the crow's day. Tim assumed the bird would leave after drying off, but days passed and he kept showing up, always landing like he owned the place, always feeling comfortable, always greeted by a lady like he'd been invited to dinner. Tim dubbed him Little, short for little shit, which was technically a quote from their first proper interaction. It happened the third week of his stay. Tim was elbow deep in files, barely keeping up with paperwork, required to nail a key player in an illegal weapons ring, even close to slipping through a legal loophole, and Tim needed one more piece of evidence to close the case. He didn't notice the crow flapping towards him. He didn't notice the sound of claws on wood until Little landed on his desk like a meteor and started aggressively hopping across the table, wings slapping like a possessed metronome. Papers went flying. Tim nearly spilled his coffee. He shouted without thinking, "Stop, you Little!" and froze. There, right in the middle of the chaos, Little was proudly presenting a slightly bloodied scrap of cloth, right on top of Tim's open file. The fabric had a serial number, one Tim recognized, the final link tying the subject to the smuggled weapons. There was a beat of stunned silence. Little flapped once, and let out a noise that sounded suspiciously smug. "You do deserve a name," Tim muttered. From that day on, Little was officially one of them. While he didn't have the soft coos or dainty manners of the does, Little proved himself over and over. He was the best collector by far, sharp-eyed, fearless, and far too clever. He knew how to tail suspects unnoticed, what shiny things mattered, and how to find documents no one else would think to check. Once he brought home a burner phone wrapped in a napkin. He got along surprisingly well with Madonna, who appreciated his blunt efficiency, and Lady, who welcomed him with the silent understanding of two generals in the same weird war. Tim didn't question it. He had long ago given up understanding the internal politics of his increasingly sentient flock. But even he had to admit, especially on days like this, there was something comforting about looking up from a frustrating mission and finding a bird aggressively pushing the answer to your problems across your keyboard, even if it occasionally involved feathers in the coffee. Brad arrived, not long after Little, carried in, quite literally, by chaos and poor decision-making. Tim could trace the timeline back to the exact moment Little began flaunting his crushy setup like a bird-shaped real estate agent. Apparently once word got out among the local crow community that some human in Gotham was willingly feeding birds gourmet seeds, plants, and rewarding them for petty thief and espionage, it was only a matter of time before someone sent reinforcements. Bart came with a mob, a very loud, very entitled mob of crows, who perched along Tim's rooftop like they were prepared for a concert. And in the middle of them all, eyes gleaming, wings fluttering in dramatic arrogance, was a crow so tiny and deceptively cute that Tim, poor foolish Tim, thought, "Ah, this one's different." He tried to pet him. It went about as well as sticking your hand into a blender full of sarcasm and knives. After stopping the bleeding and rethinking his life choices, Tim started calling the new addition Brad. Not just because of the attitude, though the attitude was monumental, but because after watching the little guy sass Lady, argue with Little, and successfully steal a grape from Madonna without dying, Tim was left with only one comparison: He's Damien with feathers. Despite the bloodshed and minor PTSD, Bart quickly proved his worth. He had an uncanny ability to mimic voices of people. Tim had only spoken to once, voices from police scanners, voices from earpieces, halfway across a warehouse. He could replicate them all with eerie accuracy, a skill that turned out to be unreasonably useful for Tim's undercover missions. Bart became his tiny winged comms partner, able to deliver false messages, redirect thugs, and even confuse surveillance teams by sounding like Batman during emotionally awkward moments. Which he did, frequently, on purpose. On mission, Bart was terrifyingly competent, focused, obedient, and quick. Off mission, he was a demon child. He read reports, unkept pens just to fling the ink everywhere, and once memorably set off Tim's silent alarm just to see how fast the Nest lockdown system worked. It was fast. Tim was not amused. Worse, he had no respect for Tim's personal space. He had decided Tim's right arm was his personal landing stripe. Regardless of whether Tim was typing, sleeping, or bleeding out. And despite multiple attempts to train him to land like a normal crow, Brett still gripped with the force of a tactical meat hook, hence the near constant bandages. Tim had taken it to explaining it as a training accident or equipment malfunction. He refused to admit he was being repeatedly savaged by a crow named after his younger brother. Still, even with the carnage and the unsolicited impressions of Jason's voice yelling, "Bro, really?" from across the room, Bart had earned his place in the Nest. He was undeniably useful. And Tim, against all odds and logic, was starting to feel a strange kind of affection for the little gremlin. Like having a really mean rumba that occasionally brings you state secrets. The third crow to officially make the Nest his home did so with all the subtlety of a Broadway opening night. His entrance was so legendary that Jason still recounted it with theatrical flair every time someone so much as hinted at visiting Tim's place. This particular crow, later cherished bastard, and for good reason, didn't slip in quietly through the secret bird window or politely waited to be fed like the others. No, he descended like the wrath of an airbound gremlin. The story went like this. Tim had just finished a patrol that ended unintentionally in Crime Alley, because of course it did, and had run into Jason. Not in the violent punch first, explained later way. No, this time Jason had simply cornered him for one of his patented, "I know you're a genius, but you're still an idiot" lectures. It was mostly concerned older brother posturing, with a little shoving for good measures. Tim was about to fire back a witty retort, then bam! A winged missile launched itself from above, zeroed in on Red Hood's face, and began screeching like his helmet had personally offended the bird gods. There was flapping, pecking, swearing, and the distinct sound of Tim trying and failing not to laugh. If Jason hadn't been wearing his helmet, Bastard would have taken his eyes out. His words, not Tim's. Naturally, the name stuck. Bastard became a permanent fixture after that. Tim didn't so much invite him into the Nest as accepted defeat after the crow started showing up unprompted, eating food meant for the doves, and establishing himself as the resident agent of chaos. And weirdly, he was effective. Tim discovered early on that Bastard had a strange sixth sense for danger. He wasn't psychic, at least Tim hoped not, but he had a habit of appearing right before something exploded, or when a gang ambush was about to spring, or, most memorably, when Tim was just about to accidentally sit on a track left behind by Brad in an act of friendly fire. So Bastard got a mission, a permanent one. Follow Tim always. Be his early warning system, his air horn with feathers, his screaming shadow of doom. Bassett took the job very seriously, especially when it came to Jason. For reasons no one could explain, Bassett had decided Red Hood was a threat, but only when Jason wore the helmet. If it was just a domino mask, no reaction. But if that glossy red dome even peeked into view, Bassett went full-on berserk mode, like Gotham's loudest, most judgmental alarm clock. Jason was thrilled. "Your crow has issues," he told Tim, the third time he had to use his grappling hook mid-air just to avoid becoming crow kibble. "Do you feed it gunpowder?" Tim's answer had been, "Only on Fridays." Bassett wasn't just loud, though. He was good, insanely stealthy, nearly invisible in both daylight and shadow, and very, very territorial, especially with the other crows. He didn't start fights, usually, but he finished them. And somehow, despite his complete disdain for structure or basic manners, he always turned up exactly where Tim needed him. He was the sneakiest, sharpest, loudest, and most feral thing in Tim's life. And Tim would admit, only under duress, he adored him. The last bird to join Tim's feathered menagerie was Sherlock, his most competent little gremlin. Unlike most of the others, whose names were lovingly given based on their very obvious personalities, Brad, Bastard, Lil, you get the trend, Sherlock earned his title through pure skill. He wasn't just one of the let's follow or emotionally repressed human club. He was a searcher, a natural scout, with the kind of observational talent that made Tim generally wonder if he had somehow trained himself. The first time Tim realized just how smart Sherlock was, he had been chasing a suspect doing a weapons raid. The guy slipped away, and for a second Tim thought the trail was lost until he noticed one of the crows circling in a perfect spiral over a building 4 blocks away. It was subtle, easy to miss, but that wasn't just a crow stretching its wings. It was Sherlock saying, "Hey idiot, over here!" Sure enough, the suspect was inside, trying and failing to hack a vending machine for a free soda. Gotham's criminal underworld wasn't always smart, just persistent. From then on, Sherlock became Tim's top recon crow. He was clever, precise, and had a memory like a steel trap. If Tim showed him a photo of a suspect or an item in the morning, there was a solid chance Sherlock would return before sunset with either the thing or something better. Tim once asked him to find a specific micro SD card. Sherlock had brought back 2 SD cards, a functioning burner phone, and someone's wallet that turned out to belong to a corrupt GCPD officer. Not the original mission, but arguably more useful. Sherlock wasn't just competent, he was brilliant, and Tim being Tim handled this discovery with all the maturity of a proud parent and competitive sibling rolled into one. He named him Sherlock, particularly to honor his intelligence, and particularly to remind himself that yes, a bird might occasionally be smarter than him. Despite their differences, the doves and crows worked in near-perfect harmony. Inside the nest, Tim's penthouse base, they opted as one unified flock. Out on missions, however, they often split by specialization. The crows tracked shadows and imminent threats. The doves detected injury, exhaustion, and emotional damage. Basically Tim's default setting. When things went wrong, and they always did, the crows noticed first. If Tim vanished, if comms went dead, if his tracker failed, they were the ones already circling the top roofs, calling reinforcements in squawks and feathers. And the doves, they knew him. Injuries, change in tone. Micro-movements, lady could find him anywhere, in any disguise. Dee sensed pain before even Tim admitted it. Madonna pinched him when he ignored a wound too long. Cece already knew where to stand if someone needed to overhear a conversation. They were clever, loyal, sharper than knives, and twice as stubborn. And somehow they adored him. The cryptic boy who fed them well muttered puzzles to himself and tried to hold Gotham together with spite, coffee, and 3 hours of sleep. Tim got used to it, the organized chaos, the chirping and cooing, and the occasional feathers in his coffee. It became his normal. For over a year and some change, the nest felt full, lively, predictable even. His lammet of doves would wake him up in the morning. His murder of crows will chase him back home at night. Until the day he came home from patrol, coffee in one hand, data chip in the other, and found a raven sitting on his desk. Just there, like he owned the place, staring, silent still. Like a ghost. And Tim just blinked and said, "Okay, that's new."